told our speaker that he actually uses a microphone correctly, because a lot of people hold it like this, and I had it bumped up really high, but he actually speaks into the microphone, so then I went and bumped it down a little bit. So if that's an issue, just let me know in the back and we'll go. I want everybody to be able to hear. But thank you for coming back. I thought last night was great, setting the table. Heard a lot of good responses from parishioners today about everything, who are really excited to hear what this night will bring, and so am I. Hello to the people on live stream again as well. We had a fairly decent amount of people watch it last night, so we'll have that again tonight. Embarrassingly, I forgot to pray last night beforehand, so we'll start this evening with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to gather tonight. We just continue to ask your blessings upon this parish mission, upon our parish in general, and all of our parishioners. Let us be open to your word and your action in our lives. Help us to learn tonight to be the most true Christians we can be, and to allow your will to live in our lives. Continue to bless our parish, bless those in our community, and we ask that all of us are strengthened in this Lent. We ask all this in your name. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And with that, I will again announce our speaker, Andrew Messina.
Great. Good to see all of you. Thanks for coming back. Who's here who this is your first night and you didn't come to... Oh, okay. Excellent. So I'll try to give a little bit of a recap of what we covered last night, so you're not totally lost and wondering, like, what is going on? What is he talking about? I'll try to give a little bit of recap of that. So essentially, the things that we covered last night had to do with the biblical texts and 4 different stories within the biblical texts and what they have to say about the wilderness experience. We talked about what I called the paradigmatic wilderness experience, which was Israel in the desert for 40 years, wandering in the desert for 40 years. And we talked about 2 different perspectives that we saw in the Hebrew Bible about that, one of them being from Numbers, this idea that the Israelites are there out of punishment from God. And then we talked about another one from Deuteronomy, where the Israelites are there essentially because it's training. And they're being trained and prepared to enter into the promised land, to take it and to maintain it, and to not forget God when they have taken it and kept it as their own. Then we talked about John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist as he's often referred to, and his experience in the wilderness, how he went out into the wilderness because he wanted to flee the city. It appears that he may have some sentiments or similarities to the Essenes. The Essenes, we might recall, thought of the wilderness as, thought of the cities as polluted, disgusting places filled with Hellenistic ideas, and so they wanted to flee into the desert, and it appears John had a similar sentiment as well, and so he fled into the desert to escape all those impurities and to begin to engage in a wilderness practice, in a purity practice in the desert itself. And then we talked about Jesus coming to John to be baptized, and his experience through that baptism and the revelation that was revealed to possibly himself, but also certainly the people around him, of what his true nature was. And then we talked about Jesus' temptations and the fact that he went through multiple temptations, probably. The biblical texts don't talk about all of them, but they talk about 3 in particular, and how those might signal possibly Jesus' greatest drives or motivations or desires or needs. And so tonight, what I'd like to do is to return to all of that, but then to think about all of that and what it might mean for us. So that when we think about the biblical text and we think about what the text is saying, what exactly is the text saying to us? How might all of these experiences apply to our lives? How might they speak to us? How might they direct us? How might they motivate us? How might they inspire us in the ways in which we approach life or the wilderness or different wildernesses. And so what I'd like to do first, and I'll spend basically the first half of our time together basically making general comments about these 4 different wilderness experiences and what they might mean to us. And then from there, I'll look at each individual wilderness experience and give a few comments about what they might mean for us individually, each one of these wilderness experiences. And so the first thing I want to say is that when we think about the biblical text and how it might apply to us today, we could think of the wilderness experience as quite literal, that God desires for us to be in the wilderness on occasion, or perhaps frequently, depending on who we are, and that experience might actually be quite literal. We should be going out to the wilderness, a wilderness of some kind. The forest, the desert, some place that is beyond where we currently live, some place that is beyond where we currently reside and what we're used to. I had an experience like this when I was in college, and I think this was actually the only literal wilderness experience that I had. My college, it was a religious college like Loras, and we went on a backpacking trip, and I went with several students and some guides and mentors on this backpacking trip, and we went literally into the wilderness and trekked for days together. I remember the most probably dramatic experience that I had on that wilderness trek. One night, we would sleep in tents together, but one night the guides had us sleep alone throughout the wilderness. And I realized as I was packing up my sleeping bag and going out into the wilderness, this is the very first time I'm sleeping by myself. And I realized every other time that I've gone to bed, it's been in the house, and moreover, somebody else has been in the house as well. And so this is the very first time I'm going to sleep. And it was a really dramatic experience. There were all sorts of conflicting feelings that I was having. On the one hand, I would hear stirrings in the bushes. And I'd be thinking to myself, geez, what is that? Is something going to grab me? Is something going to tear me apart? Because it sounded like that there was something creeping toward me. It was quite frightening, and it was pitch black, too. There was no moon out. But what I could see quite clearly were the stars. Because we were out in the wilderness and there was no unnatural lights, I could see the stars so clearly. And I could see the Milky Way across the sky, and I could see stars that I would never have seen because I lived in a city. And it was an interesting experience because on the one hand, I felt terrified in some ways, terrified for my life, but also uneasy because this is the first time I'm by myself. But I also felt this tremendous sense of wonder and awe and beauty and transcendence, looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars and feeling the presence of God. So that was one experience for me that was more of a literal wilderness experience. And so when we think about the wilderness experiences in the Bible, we could think that what we must undergo or what we could undergo could be something similar. That is one possibility. Though I would say there are other possibilities as well. And what I want to get at here is that the biblical text, one of the beauties about the way the church interprets the Bible is it's not just looking at the facts and thinking about the facts, but it also looks at the Bible allegorically. Is that a term that people have heard before, allegory? Maybe, perhaps, some people? Okay. Allegory, essentially, you could boil it down to, it looks at the biblical text and it tries to think or imagine what the Bible is saying metaphorically or spiritually to us. So something happens in the biblical text, and we think to ourselves, well, what might that spiritually mean to me? Or what might that metaphorically mean to me? Am I making sense of what allegory is about? Something happens in the Bible when we think, what could that mean to me spiritually or metaphorically? Perhaps when I work through this a little bit, it might make a little more sense. And so when you look at the wilderness experiences in the biblical text, I sense there are certain commonalities you might see across all of these experiences. And this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the commonalities that one might see, what makes a wilderness would be, number one, it removes us from what we're used to. It removes us from what is ordinary to us. It removes us from our routine. It exposes us to new elements. It moves us from our routine to a new context, exposes us to new elements that might even be harmful or threatening or dangerous. It makes us, and in that sense, it makes us feel vulnerable. We're open, or we're exposed to something new, but at the same time, we're exposed to something that we're not used to, and also it might actually be a little dangerous or possibly potentially very dangerous for us. And so in that sense as well, it can push us to our limits. push us to what we're used to, push us beyond what we're used to our very limits. And in that way, it can also force us to make difficult decisions, having to decide how we're going to act in a certain situation when we're pushed to our limits, how we're going to navigate a situation when we're very pressed, and when we're feeling the strains, the constraints, the weights of the situation that we're in. And so that's not an exhaustive list, but I would think that when you look at the 4 wilderness experiences that we talked about yesterday, those commonalities can be found in each of these wilderness experiences. And so if you were to think of that metaphorically or spiritually, you could think of experiences in your own life that you encounter in which these things occur, where experiences where you are pushed to your limits, experiences in which you are set outside of your natural context, experiences in which your rhythm is disrupted, experiences in which you have to make difficult decisions. And so if one is to think about wilderness experiences from that perspective, then we might think of wilderness experiences as a variety of experiences that we might encounter in life. Yes, we could go to the literal wilderness and have a profound experience there, and in some instances that might actually be helpful for some of us, and maybe some of us have done that before. But I would think also throughout life we also encounter experiences that could be classified as wilderness experiences. For example, a difficult situation. Difficult situations could include maybe losing a job. A difficult situation could include moving. That's something that I experienced with my family a year and a half ago. We moved from Boston to here. And especially for my daughter, I would say that she definitely felt that as a wilderness type of experience. She would constantly talk about wanting to move back to Boston. I would actually, it was kind of funny. In the house that we lived in Boston, there was a hole in the floor. We rented this place, just to be clear. We didn't just leave it there. The landlord left it there. And so there's a hole in the floor in her room, and you could just see right into the basement. And it was funny because we moved into this brand new house, this beautiful house that actually one of the members sitting in the back helped us find. And it was the best place we had ever lived by far. And my daughter said, I miss our old house. I miss the hole in the ground. But she was expressing something about a difficult experience that she was going through, being removed from her natural context, having to face new circumstances, having to be pushed to limits in ways that she wasn't used to before. Another type of wilderness experience one might encounter is a physical hardship, a physical condition that one is undergoing. That was quite profound for me recently. Both my wife and my mother was diagnosed with cancer this last year, and my wife had a tumor in her on her thyroid, which the doctor said was likely going to become cancerous. And so those were two definite difficult experiences that removed us from our daily routine and made us have to think about life in a different way. You could think of wildernesses also not just as physical hardships, but perhaps even as mental hardships, having to deal with anxiety, having to deal with a mental condition, having to deal with depression. I have a very close friend who has had to deal with depression their entire life, and you could think of that certainly as a wilderness experience, I think. Some sort of disruption of routine. This one, I think, is something that all of us have experienced in the last couple of years with the pandemic. Everything has been disrupted. Many of us, Dave was telling me that many of us weren't able to come to church simply because it wasn't safe, and we had to stay away from being around each other. We had to be careful about where we went, who we were with, had to take these nose swabs where it felt like we were getting pieces of our brain taken out of us. That is quite, I think, for all of us, a very dramatic and I think especially for some of us, a very profound and even traumatizing experience. And I would say that would certainly classify as a spiritual or metaphorical wilderness experience. You can also think of wilderness experiences as spiritual, specifically spiritual in nature. You could think of them in a variety of ways, in spiritual ways. The one that I'm thinking of in particular is moments in life in which the routines that one goes through, the rituals that one goes through feel dry or empty. You're going to Mass every week, you're praying every day, you have a strong devotional life, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything in your life. In fact, things seem to be in a rut, or you seem to be stuck. Everything, you feel disconnected from your congregation perhaps, or especially you may feel disconnected from God, or from the powerful spiritual experiences you've had before. I would certainly think of that as a potential wilderness experience. And the last one I want to talk about, and this is not an exhaustive list, but the last one that comes to my mind is a feeling of isolation, being separate from other people, or feeling like you are disconnected from people. Maybe friends and family that were once in your life are no longer in your life for one reason or another. Having to deal with life in such a way where you don't really have the normal people that you have relied on or talked to or cared about no longer present in your life, either physically or emotionally. I would certainly think of that as a possibility of a wilderness experience. If it's okay, I would like, just for the next 20 to 30 seconds, I'm hoping this might be helpful, if we just pause perhaps for a moment, and all of us maybe think to ourselves of a potential wilderness experience, a metaphorical one or a spiritual one or a literal one, that we are maybe currently going through, or potentially that we may go through, that we know that we're going to go through, or maybe one that we feel that we've just exited, or perhaps something, an experience that somebody is having that we know about, that someone else is going through. So just take maybe 10, 20 seconds to think about a potential wilderness experience or an actual wilderness experience, and then we'll think about that as we go through the rest of tonight. So if you're still thinking, feel free to keep going until you're done. But perhaps keep that experience in mind as we talk about the rest of, or as we go through the rest of tonight. There's a couple of things I wanted to bring up in regard to wilderness experiences and what might be one and what might not be one. The first thing is what might be a wilderness for one person may not necessarily be a wilderness for another person. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, especially when we share our experiences with each other. And I say that because, for many reasons, but the one that's coming to my mind the most is we can have a tendency to listen to someone and perhaps minimize their experience and say, well, it's not really that big of a deal, or you need to buck up and get over it, or you're fine, don't worry about it. But it might actually be a really intense experience for them, and it might be a really important experience for them, and it may be important to see it the way they do it and to help them through it by acknowledging it with them. The other thing I wanted to suggest also is that a wilderness experience, it may not be clear to someone that they're actually going through this type of experience. Somebody may be in a situation where they're living life and they are having difficulties, and they're not sure why they're having those difficulties, but they're just living life, and they're suffering through that difficulty. And so in that sense, it might actually be a powerful thing for us to suggest to them that perhaps what they are going through is a type of wilderness. And that they're going through a spiritual or metaphorical or literal experience that should be acknowledged. And once it's acknowledged, then they can start to work through it, and then they can start to think about it, and then they can start to find their way through it. That might actually be an important thing. And so perhaps we might keep that in mind as we go through, as we think about wilderness experiences and others in relation to us. Few more comments I wanted to make, just general comments I wanted to make about the wilderness. Some are short, and some are long. Some last a short period of time, some last one's entire life. Jesus, you could say, is an example of a wilderness experience that lasted a short period of time. He was tempted, relatively speaking, he was in the wilderness for 40 days. That actually seems perhaps like a long period of time. But at the same time, it wasn't his whole life. He was there for 40 days being tempted in the wilderness, and then he left. Likewise, he went to John for a short period of time, and then he left. John assumed that he would be in the wilderness for his entire life. And he chose to go into the wilderness, and he chose to stay there for his entire life. Israel, if you were 20 years or older, you were guaranteed to live and then die in the wilderness over those 40 years. And so some experiences are short-lived. Some experiences may last a long time. Other experiences might last the course of one's whole life. And this could be part of the experience too, I think. Not knowing if and when an experience will end. That may be part of the wilderness experience as well, not knowing if there's going to be an end date or when the end date will be. I think perhaps some of us might be thinking of COVID, actually. We all thought that we would be virus-free last summer, and then what happened? Delta came around. And then Delta started to subside, and then we all thought it was all over going into Thanksgiving, and then Omicron came. And some of us now think perhaps we are finally reaching the end, and there's the new variant. It's called the stealth Omicron. People have heard of this, which some epidemiologists are predicting will cause the next wave in America. And I don't say this lightly, not in the least. COVID has had dramatic impacts on many people. My family has certainly felt it. It certainly has not been nearly as dramatic as other people. Some of the things that we experienced, right when it started, my son was born. And it was a really frightening time. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. This was the time in which none of us knew just how virulent this disease was, how it spread. My wife worked in a hospital, and we had to make the hard decision for her to quit her job. Because we were afraid that she would contract the virus while she was at the hospital and then bring it home to our newborn, and that he might, or even our daughter might catch it. And so that put us in a really difficult position because I was the only one with an income, and we depended on two people having an income. It's also affected us in other ways too, not nearly as bad as other people. I really want to emphasize that, but still, nevertheless, it's had an impact. For example, my best friend, when he got married, I was supposed to be his best man and go to his wedding, but that was right during the midst of the Delta wave. And so I live with vulnerable people in my home, and I do my best to protect them, and so I had to make the hard decision of not going to his wedding because for fear of that I might catch it either on the plane or at the events and then bring it home to the vulnerable people in my house. And then a year later, my brother was getting married, and I was supposed to go to his wedding. And that was right during the peak of the Omicron wave. And then again, I had to make the hard decision not to attend the wedding because I was fearful of the vulnerable people in my house, and I didn't want to bring it home to them. So this is definitely something that I don't say lightly, but perhaps if I might suggest that maybe part of the point of some wilderness experiences and what makes them an actual experience is not knowing when they're going to end. And that's part of the point. That's part of what makes it the actual wilderness experience, not knowing that there is an end date, or when that might be, or if it might be. What is the purpose of a wilderness experience, or what makes a wilderness experience a biblical wilderness experience? I would say that what makes it biblical, or what makes it, you might even say, a religious experience, or what makes it a Christian experience, is that there is a meaning and purpose behind it. I think that's what makes it a biblical or religious or even Christian experience. And what I mean by that is, from a biblical perspective, and you see this from the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament, this idea that God is behind every action, everything that happens, that somehow, in some way, God is behind everything. Every good thing, and also every bad thing. In some way, God is behind all of those actions. And so when one goes into the wilderness, it is because God wanted them to go into the wilderness. Israel went into the wilderness for 40 years because God commanded them to. John went into the wilderness because God guided him into the wilderness. Jesus went into the wilderness because the Spirit led him into the wilderness. Every single wilderness experience happens because somehow, in some way, God is behind that action and somehow, in some way, desires for that to happen. And so when one thinks about the purpose of these experiences, you could look at each of these wilderness experiences, I think, and you could think of them as each of them conveying a certain purpose that one might encounter in the wilderness. That each of these experiences somehow communicates an individual purpose for that experience, the reason why it's happening. One of them that you think about is revelation. The idea that something is now being revealed to you, that you're gaining new insights, new knowledge, something profound that you didn't know before. That could be a potential wilderness experience. That's certainly what we see going on during the baptism of Jesus. One could say perhaps that he himself had this experience. One could also say that it was everybody else around him that had this profound revelatory moment. Either way, what I think this moment is exemplifying is that when you go into the wilderness, one possible outcome is that you will learn something new, learn something profound. And I want to add a caveat there. It may not be as profound as finding out you're the Son of God. And if that is your takeaway, maybe come talk to me afterward, or maybe talk to Father Steve, just so we can get some clarity on what's going on. It doesn't need to be a dramatic experience for it to be worthwhile. That's the point I want to make. It doesn't have to be the most profound realization of your life for it to be worthwhile. Sometimes we feel this pressure that in order for something to be worth it, it has to be the most significant thing in our lives. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It can be an important realization. It doesn't have to be the most important realization. The second purpose that an experience like this might have is that it might refine you, that it might test you, that it might try to prod you to make sure of certain things. And that's kind of an odd thing to think about. Why would God test us? That's kind of an odd thing to think about. Why would God actively test us? After all, don't we pray in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, or lead us not into the time of testing? We actually ask God every Mass for God not to do that, and yet it would appear that that is an important part of a potential experience in the wild or in the desert. And it would appear that for Jesus, and it would also appear that for the Israelites, depending on which interpretation of the Israelites wandering you're going with, if you went with the Deuteronomy one, where Israel is being prepared to enter into the Promised Land, it would appear that testing is important for a very critical reason, because it helps one discover who one really is. One may not fully know who one is until one has actually been put to the test. Who am I going to be when I face this situation? Will I be who I imagine myself to be? Before one faces the test, it is essentially an imaginative exercise, what one thinks one will be. And one only really knows who one is when one has faced a test, how one emerges from that test. And the test can be for a variety of reasons. And those reasons may not be evident when one goes into a time of testing. Jesus, it appears from the presentation that he knew why he was going into the wilderness. It was to test himself to make sure that he was ready to take on the responsibility of a ministry and also the responsibility of being the Messiah. It appears that potentially he knew that going into the wilderness. But there may be tests where you're not really sure what's going on or why the test is happening in the first place. For example, the character Job. Everybody heard of Job in the Bible? He was a man that received enormous tests. One day, Satan goes up to God, as if that's just a casual thing to do, and says to God, I bet, or God actually says to Satan, have you seen Job? Have you seen how righteous and how noble he is? And then Satan says, I bet you I could turn him. I could make him curse you. And then God says, all right, give it a shot. And Job has no idea that this is going on. All he knows is that he's losing his family, he's losing his wealth, he's losing his health, he's losing everything that he enjoys and loves. At the end, you could say that God finally reveals to him why the test occurred in the first place. But one might also make the argument that perhaps Job was not fully as righteous as God put him up to be until he faced those tests. It was only at the end of those tests that one could finally say that he was righteous, that he was noble, and that he could withstand anything and that his righteousness would remain. One may not be able to say that until those experiences happen, until that test actually happens. The character Satan is kind of an interesting phenomenon, I think. Satan is thought of in different ways, depending on which biblical text you're looking at. It would appear that the author of Job thought of Satan in more of a perhaps traditional Hebrew Bible understanding, which is that he wasn't some figure who had rebelled against God and was actively trying to work against God's will. Rather, what's imagined is that God has a heavenly court. And that God has different members of the heavenly court who perform different tasks. And Satan's task was to operate in God's courtroom. Satan acts as the adversary, and that's what Satan means in Hebrew. And what the adversary does is essentially similar to a prosecutor. He's prosecuting cases, trying to prove people guilty in order to determine who people really are. That seems to be what's going on in the book of Job. By the time you get to the New Testament, the sense of who Satan actually is changes quite dramatically in certain biblical texts, especially when you look at the book of Revelation. Satan seems to take on more of the rebellious role where he has rebelled against God and he's trying to get other people or people of the earth to rebel against God. And it's interesting because if Satan's the one who initiates the tests, and if we need tests in order to determine who we really are, then is the implication that we're supposed to invite Satan into our lives? That's kind of weird and dangerous. I would say no. I don't think the takeaway is after we leave here, let's pray and hope Satan enters into our lives and tests us. But what I would say the takeaway is that if one claims to be a follower of God, if one claims to have devoted oneself to God, if one claims to be a Christian, then at a certain point, or at many points, one's going to have to prove that. And that seems to be part of God's design. If you are who you say you are, then if you can endure this test, then you really are who you say you are. That those tests are important for one to discover whether one really is devoted to God or part of this tradition or community or not. In terms of purification, this was the original hope that John the Baptist had. He went into the wilderness in order to purify himself. And you could think of purification, I think, in a number of different ways. John thought of it as, here I am amongst all these polluted, contorted, twisted, disgusting ideas, and I need to get away from them. I need to flee into the desert so I don't have to be exposed to all of these dangerous, harmful ideas. One could think of purification in that way. You're removing yourself from a context in which you feel dragged down, weighed by different ideas that, or situations or circumstances that are getting to you, and you think that it may not be congruent with the way in which one should live or think. That could be a way in which one thinks about purification. I think there are also other ways in which one might think of purification as well. You could think of purification as a release of some sort, or relief, maybe relief from guilt. You have done something and you're weighed down by your guilt, and you need to be relieved from that. And perhaps a wilderness experience might be the thing that relieves you finally from the guilt that you feel. Even though you have received forgiveness, even though you've been to confession, you still feel that weight of guilt, and perhaps an experience might free one from that guilt. It could be a relief from a pressing circumstance that you're encountering, something that has been really weighing on you. It could be a relief from something that has weighed you down, has been an enormous burden on your life. It could be a relief from living life in a rut. You're constantly doing the same thing over and over again, and you finally realize, I gotta get out of this. I gotta I gotta do something different. I gotta try something new. It could be any of those things, I think. Purification, in a very strict sense, in the Hebrew Bible, is the transfer from one state to another. And if one thinks of purification in that sense, it could manifest in a variety of ways. It requires one to move from one state to another, to leave one place and go to another, either to live a new life, to live a refreshed life, to live a renewed life, or possibly even to gain a new perspective. This is something that, or a metaphor I often give my undergrads. When they encounter the academic study of religion, it's often quite new to them, and they're not quite used to studying religion from an academic perspective. And I tell them, in some ways, it's like up to this point, you've been living in a house, and you are used to that house. You've lived in that house your whole life, and you have a familiarity with that house. But because you've lived in the house your whole life, you've never actually seen what the house looks like on the outside. You don't really know what the side paneling, what the roof looks like, whether there's a chimney, whether there is another floor. Perhaps you've been living on the bottom floor of your house your whole life. But if you step outside, if you leave what you're used to, if you leave your natural context, and then if you then look back, you might gain a new perspective that you hadn't had before on that very same house. It might help you see the same exact thing in a brand new way, which might be the most refreshing thing you had ever experienced. Then again, it might be the most refreshing thing, but it might be an important way of getting a new perspective on something that you have been in your entire life. The last one is perhaps the most difficult of them all to think about. And it's really difficult and fraught because what is being proposed in the Bible is that one may be going through a difficult period because it is a punishment from God. That's a really difficult thing to swallow, I think, this idea. And we might think to ourselves, are we ready to admit or to think that a difficult situation that we are going through is a actual punishment for something that we have done? I don't know. Is it possible to think of COVID that way? That this is a punishment from God on humanity? That's a really tough thing to think about. That's a really hard pill to swallow. It bucks against our modern sensibilities. Often when one thinks about why evil occurs, this is the theological question of theodicy, perhaps a more palpable pill to swallow is God doesn't initiate bad things in the world. God fixes the bad things in the world. God is a reactive God. That seems to be the more palpable pill to swallow. But that pill doesn't quite square away with what the biblical texts are saying. It says quite explicitly in Numbers 14, the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years precisely because they disobeyed God, and this was God's punishment on them. And this is more of a Hebrew Bible perspective, this idea that when one has incurred sin or a negative action, there is a twin response from God once one has repented. One response from God is forgiveness that always comes, but that forgiveness does not relieve the punishment that follows. Those two have to be present for the entire cycle to be complete, for this entire process to be complete. Forgiveness and punishment. Those are two parts of the same coin from a Hebrew Bible perspective. And again, it's still a really strange and difficult thing to think about. And I don't want to suggest anything in particular, but I might suggest perhaps a metaphor that might help one gain a perspective on where these biblical texts are coming from. When you think to yourself, when you were, for those of you who were parents, or even when you were a kid, what was the most effective way that parents help children grow and become successful, mature adults? Is it simply by forgiving them and saying that's okay, and then you can then go on with your life? Or is it also potentially sometimes having actual punishments for your children so that they really learn what they have done and the consequences of what they've done, and so that they then learn from that and then grow from that? If punishments are effective with children, would that perhaps be the case with us who are children of God? Just something to ponder, to think about. Again, it's a really tough thing to think about, I think. The possibility that a wilderness experience is a form of punishment. It's a very difficult thing to think about. One might wonder, how do I know what the purpose is? Which of these four, or perhaps another one, might be the purpose of why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing? I think, as all of us know, in order for us to be thriving human beings, we need meaning and we need purpose in life. You might think to yourself, when I do something and I suddenly don't want to do it anymore, what's the reason for it? Why do I not want to do this anymore? Often I think the reason is because we've lost meaning in what we're doing, or we've lost a sense of purpose in what we're doing. And so for us to be thriving human beings, we need meaning and purpose in life. That desire for meaning and purpose often compels one to try to discover what the meaning and purpose of something is as soon as possible. It's a natural, I think, human inclination. But that human inclination to want to discover the meaning and purpose of something as soon as possible might actually rush the process when one is experiencing a wilderness moment. And so I don't have a formula for all of us of how you can discover what the purpose is of a wilderness experience. I don't have a 3-step proposal, and if I did, I would probably be pretty skeptical of me, because I think I'm a shyster. But what I can suggest is that the meaning or purpose that we want to rush ourselves toward, if that is us, may not actually be the meaning and purpose. It might be something else. And that meaning and purpose of the wilderness experience that we're having may come to us slowly over a long period of time. It may not reveal itself to us right away. This is where I think the wilderness experience of the Israelites in Numbers and Deuteronomy actually might be instructive for us. Numbers says that the reason for it was punishment. Deuteronomy says the reason for the wilderness wandering for 40 years was as an act of preparation. Two different reasons, written during two different time periods. What I find perhaps instructive about that is we might begin with a reason for why we're going through a wilderness experience, and that might be important for a time. But then as we live more, we may come to another realization of why we're undergoing this that may be important now. In other words, the process by which we come to understand why it is we're going through what we're going through, that may be an evolving process. We might have an initial sense that is important for us. Then again, it might transform for us later on down the road. I have an example from my own life. When I was a kid, I contracted a rare disease called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Has anybody heard of that syndrome before? It's an autoimmune disorder where your immune system turns against you. It basically thinks that you yourself are a virus, and so it attacks you. All sorts of things happen to your body. I will not get into the details of that. If you want to get a sense of what happened, you can type in Stevens-Johnson syndrome into Google, and just be prepared. There are some very graphic images there, and then you can imagine me undergoing those graphic situations. So that was certainly, I would say, a wilderness experience that I was going through. The doctors, for a time, felt I was going to die. Stevens-Johnson's can lead to mortality. The doctors were also worried I was going to have all sorts of other physical, permanent physical harms. Some of them did pan out, some of them didn't, thankfully. And at the time that I was going through this syndrome, this autoimmune disorder, I was in the hospital for a few weeks in intensive care. My parents were separated, and I thought the purpose of this experience was it was going to bring them back together. That this intense experience was going to bring them back together, and that they would reconcile their differences, sort of like a Hallmark movie, as you will. But that did not happen. They got divorced. And sadly, Hallmark did not call me to use my story for one of their movies. One of the greatest regrets of my life. No, just kidding. So that did not happen, but I thought that was the reason for this illness. I can say that I don't really know what the full purpose of that experience was, but I have gained some things from it. I mean, it's not that those things were the things that made it all worthwhile, but I have gained important things from it. For example, it is a continual reminder to me to be grateful for the physical health that I have. Because I know it can be taken away, and I know I could have lost much more than I did. And so it reminds me to be grateful for the health that I have, whatever health that might be. It's also given me a perspective on life. Death, when I was a kid, like for most kids, was a very scary thing. And then I faced it pretty closely, and it's not necessarily something that I worry about anymore. I don't go out and actively seek it, just to be clear. But it's something that is not as, it doesn't weigh on me like it used to. It's something that I feel more accepting toward. It's something that I feel, yes, it will come, and when it comes, that it will come, and I will be ready for that. So those are a couple of things that I gained from that experience, things that took me years to come to the realization of, and certainly not things that I think are the definitive answers of why it happened to me, and certainly not the things I originally thought were the reasons why I went through that experience in the first place. If you look at the text that we passed out the other day, or yesterday, I wanted to turn to page 5. And I wanted to say a couple of things here. So if you look at Matthew 11, 7 through 15, this is talking about, so Jesus is in the middle of his ministry, and John hears about what Jesus is doing, and John wants to figure out what Jesus is up to. And so John has some people come to Jesus to try to figure out what Jesus is up to, and this is where the story picks up. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John came. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. Let anyone with ears listen. Essentially what Jesus is getting at here is that a lot of people went to John in the wilderness because they thought he was a prophet. And that's what they expected to receive from John, was a prophecy about the future or about their own lives, for John to transform them in some way. And what Jesus is pointing out here is, yes, you did go out to see a prophet, but what actually you were meant to see was something more than a prophet. You were meant to see me. Essentially, you were meant to have the Son of God revealed to you. In other words, we may go out into a wilderness experience expecting one thing, but it may actually be something more than what we expect. Or we may think the purpose of our wilderness experience is one thing, but it may actually be something profoundly more than what we originally hoped or thought it would be. The last thing I wanted to get at was this idea of a wilderness being forced or unforced. That's an interesting concept, I think. If you think about John and Jesus, John went into the wilderness essentially on his own volition. He went there because he wanted to go there. You could say that he was guided by God. You could say that he was guided by the Spirit. But he went there because he wanted to go there. Jesus also went to John, it appears in the text, because he wanted to go there. Yes, he was guided by God, but he actively wanted to go there. Then again, Jesus, according to Mark, was driven into the wilderness to be tempted precisely because Satan, or precisely because the Spirit was driving him there. It doesn't necessarily seem to be that that was something he was actively seeking, but rather the Spirit was driving him into the wilderness. The Israelites didn't really want to spend 40 years wandering the wilderness. They wanted to get to the promised land. But that's what God wanted them to do. And so that's an interesting thing, I think, to think about is when you look at these texts and the different ways in which one ends up in a wilderness, some of them are because one chooses to be there. Others are because one has to be there. And that perhaps has implications for us as well. Some of the wilderness experiences that we have in life are because we choose to be there. Others may actually be because we didn't ask for it, but we have to be there. Something perhaps to think about. I can see that we're nearing the end. And so what I'd like to do is to just think a little bit about the experience that Jesus has during his temptations. If you could return to that text too. It's on page 4. And as you can see, as Satan is tempting Jesus, Jesus has a series of responses to Satan. In fact, he's quoting the Bible to Satan. It's an interesting response that Jesus has, I think. And one could think of the implications of that in a number of different ways. The biblical text that he's citing is actually Deuteronomy 8, the text that we read, and Deuteronomy 6. And so one takeaway one could have from that is Jesus is quoting texts or biblical texts, and those are preserving his integrity. And so if I quote biblical texts when I'm feeling tempted, that will preserve my integrity. One could think of it that way, and that is certainly one possible reading of what's going on here. One could also think of it as Jesus is quoting these biblical texts because he is reminded of the stories that are occurring in these biblical texts. In other words, he is thinking about the experiences that Israel had in the wilderness, their triumphs and also their failures. And he is drawing inspiration and encouragement from their triumphs, and he's also looking at their failures as cautionary tales. And he's using all of that to help him through this moment of temptation that he's feeling. And that may be another way to think about when one is faced with temptation. That when one is faced with it, one could quote biblical texts, and that may be a powerful generating force to keep one secure and through it. Another way to think about it also is when one is faced with temptation, perhaps think of those who came before you. It could be a biblical person. It could be a saint. It could be a person that you look up to. It could be somebody in your life. Thinking about the joys and the triumphs of some people, thinking about the failures of others, and using those as a generating force to help you face the situation that you're in. That may be possibly another way to think about these temptations. The last thing I wanted to leave us with is, if you look at verse 12 in Luke, this is on page 4, Jesus answered them, it is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. This is what we left off with yesterday. In other words, the tests never end. And that could be a real depressing thought. Oh, geez, I'm going to be tested my entire life. Oh, great. What the heck did I sign up for? Can I switch religions? That could be a real depressing thought. But I sense that in the text, but I think it could also be seen in a different way. And the other way that I think of it is, we are not perfect. I'm definitely not perfect. There are some tests that we pass. There are some tests that we don't pass. And I think there's something encouraging about that, that the devil will keep coming back. Because I think what it indicates is, even when you fail tests, you'll be given another test. In other words, you'll be given another chance to succeed. And I think there's something actually really encouraging about that, that when I fail, and when I fail over and over and over again, there will be another test. And I think that is, in some ways, the mark of a good parent. Those of us who can remember our parents, or those of us who are parents, I think we can all sense that one of the marks of a good parent is patience. And if patience is important for a parent, then God, who is the parent of all of us, that's a good mark of God's quality as well, that God would be so patient with us, that God would give us one test after another, that when we fail, we're given another chance to succeed. And when we fail again, we are then given another chance to succeed. And this is the love of God being granted to us, that we always are given a chance to succeed, and that failure is never the end of the story. So that's all I have for all of you. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Appreciate it, and good to see all of you. And have a good rest of your evening. I'll turn it over to Dave.
Okay, thank you again, everybody, for coming. I think that was it's good for me to sit back and just listen to. It's a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us. I just read recently about the monks, and when someone say, why would anybody join a monastery? And basically they're saying they enter a wilderness on their own terms because they know life will give it to them, and it will give those wildernesses to them anyway. And that, I think, is the uniting thing. And actually, when I listen to all this, the commonality is, if we can support each other in those, because everybody's dealing with something, and if you can help that to understand, I've got my wildernesses and you got yours, and as Christians, we're kind of called to figure out how this is trying to help us grow. Man, then we've won, right? That's the whole thing that I take, or that's a lot of tonight's message that I kind of internalized. So again, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Holy Week's coming up. I hope that's a blessed week for you and a prayerful one, and then we can all celebrate Easter together, all right? So thanks again, everybody. I'm sure Andrew would be happy to answer questions, but you can clap again. All right, have a good night. Stay dry.